This is a really early course I made on how to create a Simon game in JavaScript. Even though I made it a few years ago, everything still applies. JavaScript only changes just a little bit as time goes on, and it's almost always backwards compatible. And everything that I cover in this course are things that pretty much all JavaScript developers need to know. So let's make a Simon game. Today I am going to show you how to make a Simon game using mainly JavaScript, but also HTML and CSS. Simon is a game, it's based on a real game, a physical game in real life, and we're going to recreate it with JavaScript. And there is a 4 different lights or colors, and they will light up in a certain order. So the player has to remember the order. Each round, an additional light is added, and the player has to remember all the order so far in the game until you get to 20 rounds, and then you win the game. So let's see what the final product is going to look like. So here's how the Simon game works. There are this power button, the strict button, and the start button. So this is supposed to simulate a physical Simon toy game, and the physical Simon toy game has a power switch. So that's what this checkbox turns the game on. You can see when I click the power button, you can see right in this count square, this red line appears to indicate that the game is on. And then the strict mode means that if you get one wrong answer, you lose the whole game. So if strict mode is on, you get one wrong answer and the whole game is lost. With strict mode off, if you get a wrong answer, you can start from where you left off. So let me show you an example how it works. This is a memory matching game, so you have to remember the order of the colors. Let's do this. If I press start, so I have to remember the order of these. Oh, I got it wrong. So since I got it wrong, it starts from where I left off. So let's do this again. You will notice that for every round, the count goes up by 1. And if I get something wrong, the count flashes no. So it starts from where I left off because I'm not in strict mode. But if I turn on strict mode and I get it wrong, you can see this count is going to go down to 1 because I got it wrong. And I have to start the game all over again. So let's go into the code because this is what we're going to be building. Okay, I have Sublime Text open on the left, and then I just have my browser with the Simon game open on the right. And in this tutorial, I'm mainly going to focus on the JavaScript. So I already have the HTML and the CSS written. You can see the HTML file here, the CSS file here. The JavaScript file is empty. So I'm going to review the HTML and the CSS and show you how those work. And then I'm actually going to write all the JavaScript and explain that as I go. First, let's see how the project is structured. So my root folder is just Simon game, and then I have my index.html file. That's the file you see here. And then I have a JavaScript folder and a CSS folder. Now inside these folders, there's just one file. So really, we could have probably put all of this into the root folder. But it's good to get into the mindset of the best practices, and generally you'll have all of your JavaScript in one folder and all of your CSS in another folder. So right now we're not going to need to see this file structure again, so I'll just close that. Okay, and let me just readjust this a little bit, and I'm going to start going through this HTML here. So you can see from here to here is the heading. Now this is stuff that's not going to really appear on the page, but it's stuff important for the page. The first thing I want to point out is this font here. I'm bringing in a Google font. Now, Google makes all these fonts that you can use on websites. They're free to use, and they have a lot of unique fonts that you can use. So that's the word Simon here uses the Google font. It's called Original Surfer. So if you just look up Google Fonts, it gives you instructions on how to include them in your web page. And also there's Google Font Effects. So you can see right here it says effect equals emboss. And that's why you can kind of see a border around this. It's embossed. And Google Fonts have all sorts of effects you can use. So I would highly recommend looking up Google Fonts and the effects if you're not already familiar with them. And then here is where we link to our CSS file. That's the one right here. And then something else to look at is how we are basically importing these audio files to use. So there's 4 different audio files. We have the audio tag, and there's the opening and closing tag. In HTML, most tags have opening and closing tags, and we have these set to different IDs, which we will reference later in our JavaScript. And the source is just this file right here. If you're following along, you can use these same files, or you can use your own files. So we have the 4 different audio files for the sounds that are going to play when each of the buttons are pressed. Before I go over the rest of the HTML, so this HTML here is what actually makes up the actual page that you can see here. But let's go over to the CSS. I'm not going to go through everything on here. I will link to both the HTML and the CSS in the description of the video, so you're not going to have to type all of this out if you're following along. You can just download the HTML file and the CSS file. In fact, all these files will be on the GitHub repository that's linked to in the description. So you can see for the body, you can really use anything for the background, but I just use this repeating pattern here. That's why we have this texture. We could have also used a solid color. And then this is just standard CSS. You can see that I'm using the Google font for some of these things. And so for CSS, just a quick refresher, if you have a dot, that's going to apply to a class. And then if you have a hash mark like this, it's going to apply to an ID. So I'll actually explain that a little more once we get back to our HTML here. So in the body of our HTML, we have this outer circle. And this outer circle, you can see this is the opening div tag, and this is the closing in tag. So everything is within the outer circle. That's this dark black circle all around here. And then here, we have the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. And those are just these colors here. And the IDs are important for 2 reasons. The point of IDs is that there's only one of them. So whereas classes, you can have multiple things with the same class, IDs, you can only have one element with the same ID. So we use the IDs in our CSS. That's one of the ways we use them. For instance, with this top left here, if I go in here, if I scroll down, we'll be able to see top left. And this is the CSS to create this green section here. You can even see background is dark green here. The other purpose of the IDs is that we can reference them in JavaScript. And a lot of these we are going to reference in JavaScript because we are going to add click handlers, and we are going to use JavaScript to show what's going to happen when you click the different elements on the page. So we also have this inner circle. That's this gray circle here, and it has a bunch of stuff inside the inner circle. You can see nested within the circle. So we have the title, And you can see that there's a special class, font, effect, emboss, and that's how we get the effect on this from the Google font. And then we have these switches. The switches are these check marks here. Now we could change these check marks to be toggle switches or buttons or something that would look more similar to the physical Simon game toy. But for now, I just have them as checkboxes. Like we have the power button, the strict button, and then we also have the start button. So if you want to improve upon this project, one idea would be to style these a little more to look like actual buttons or toggles or switches. You could do that using CSS or maybe even use some JavaScript for that. So we have these 3 buttons here, and then we just have the labels, power and strict. Now turn, that's this box here that's going to tell what turn we're on when we're playing the game, and that's pretty much everything here. The last thing I want to show you in the HTML is this script tag that links to our JavaScript file, and you'll see it's at the very end. Now the CSS is up here at the top. We link to the CSS file, but we link to the JavaScript file at the end. Some people do link to JavaScript files at the beginning, just like the CSS file, but it's really best practice to link to the JavaScript at the end. And that is because we want to make sure all of the HTML is loaded before we load the JavaScript, because the JavaScript is going to reference some of the items in the HTML. And so if the JavaScript loaded too quickly before the HTML was loaded, it could create some problems. Okay, it's time to get to the good stuff, the JavaScript. So hopefully you're following along and actually typing this all out yourself. That's how you're really going to learn. I mean, you can just watch and just try to learn just from observing, but if you actually type this out yourself and follow along, it's going to help you understand the concepts a lot more, and you can try out different things. So like I said, you can just download the CSS and the HTML from the links in the description, but the JavaScript, it would be nice if you typed it out with me. So first, we are going to just type out some of the variables we're going to use. So I'm going to declare our first variable with let order equal, and then I'm going to put an empty array here. These 2 brackets, that's how we're going to set this variable named order to this array. Now, JavaScript, you're usually going to end all your lines with a semicolon. Let is a way to initialize a variable. There's 3 different ways to initialize a variable. We have let, we have var, and then there's const. And var, I'm just going to do a brief overview of what the different things are. Var will apply to the scope of your entire program. Let will be a little more of a limited scope and only apply to where it was defined. And const stands for constant, and constants cannot be changed. So once you set a variable with const, you can't set it to something else later. So most people say you should only use let and const, and you should never use var. So we're just going to use let here. So order, this is a variable that's going to keep track of the order of the lights and how they're going to flash. We're also going to have let player order. Now this is going to be the order that the player is pressing the lights in. And let flash, this is going to be basically an integer. Now with JavaScript, you don't set the types of the variables, but generally you do keep them at one type for the most part. And this is just going to be the number of flashes that have appeared in the game. We're also going to have let turn to keep track of what turn we're on. Let good, and this is going to be a Boolean, true or false, whether the player is doing well or not. If the player has hit all the right colors, or if the player has not hit all the right colors. And let comp turn also is going to be a Boolean, true or false. It's going to keep track of whether it's the computer's turn or the player's turn. We're also going to have let interval ID. I'm going to explain that one a little later. Then let strict is going to keep track of if the strict button has been, the check mark has been checked. It's going to start at false because it's going to start unchecked. Let noise equals true if we're playing noise. This will make more sense later in the program. Let on equals false, and that's if the program has been turned on, the power button here, and it's going to start turned off. And then let win, this is just going to say if the player has won the game or not. So now we're going to use some consts. We have to have a way to get some of our HTML elements to reference them in JavaScript. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to reference some of our HTML elements in JavaScript. I'm going to show you how to do that. We're going to have the turn counter. Now the turn counter is this right here, and we want to reference that in JavaScript. So I'm going to use this document.query selector, and then I'm going to pass in a CSS selector. So I'm going to just type in turn here. So when I do document.query selector, I can pass in any CSS selector, and this hashtag turn means an element with the ID of turn. So if I go into my HTML, you'll see it right here. We have an ID of turn. So now we've actually taken that HTML element and put it into this variable, turn counter. And now we can use our JavaScript to manipulate that. We're going to do that a few more times. Const top left equals document.query selector, and then this time it will just be top left, and then we'll just kind of speed this up a little bit. Okay, you can see now I have a variable for all the elements we're going to reference. The top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, the strict button, the on button, and the start button. These are all the elements that you can interact with. Besides the turn counter, you can't interact with the turn counter, but all these other elements we can interact with, and we're going to use JavaScript for the interaction. So we just use the CSS selectors for each of those elements, like top left. You can see here ID of top left, and then we got all these elements into variables, and since they're always going to stay the same, we were able to use const. So now that we have the variables set up, we can start writing the code that's going to allow us to interact with the game and play the game. So how I'm going to organize this is I'm going to write the program in the order that you would play the game. So first of all, you're going to interact with these buttons here, like the power button, the strict button, and the start button. So I'm just going to start, we'll just start with the strict button for now. So I'm going to reference the strict button. Now this is the variable we just made up here, and I'm going to add event listener. And so if we add an event listener, it's going to be listening for some event on that element. And the event is going to be change. And so I'm going to pass in a function. Now this is going to be an arrow function here. There's a couple ways to make functions in JavaScript, and this is a common way for event listeners where this is what we're going to be passing into the function, and you put the arrow, the equal, and then the more than sign, and we have these curly braces, and this is what's going to happen when that check box is changed. So I'm going to put if strict. Well, before I actually do this, I want to actually show you it working. So let's just do a console.log, and I'm going to say checked. So a console.log, if we open up the JavaScript console, we can see something happen with this. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to refresh here. Now I'm going to open up the JavaScript console on the side here. Now, this, if I click the strict button, we should see something appear here. Okay, you can see it now says checked because this changed. Now, this would actually work. You can see every time I click here, it increases the number because it's saying that it has put that word that many times. This could really be also add event listener click. This could be click or change, and it would do the same thing because we're just trying to keep track of when we clicked it or changed it. Because we are going to, in the code, the logic of the code, it's going to check whether that checkbox is checked or not. So let me show you that now. First of all, I'll close the JavaScript console, and we'll just move this back over. So we can see the code a little better. So what I'm going to do here is say if strict button dot checked equals true. So that's a way that we can see if this is checked. Now dot checked is only going to be something we can use if we're dealing with a checkbox. But since strict button is a checkbox, we can see if it's checked as true, or if it's not checked, it will be false, then we can do something. So if it's checked, if it's true, we're going to set strict to equal true. Else, we are going to set strict to equal false. So this is just a standard if-else statement. So if it's checked, strict should be true, else strict should be false. So we've now just finished that whole button, and we can go on to the next button, which is going to be the on button. So again, I'm going to do an add event listener, and again it's going to be a click event. And so I'll pass in the event. You'll see, notice that above we pass in the event to this function, and we never use that event here. That's okay. It's still that's still when you're creating an event listener, you always pass in the event even when you're not going to use that event in the function. So this time, again, we're going to check if the on button dot checked equals true. And so if the on button is checked, we'll do a few. Now we're going to do two things. We are going to set on to equal true, just like we set strict to equal true. And remember, these variables come from up here, on and strict. But we're going to do one more thing. If you remember in the example I showed you at the beginning, when you turn the power on, we want a line to appear right here to show that it's on. So to do that, I'm going to do turn counter dot inner HTML. Now inner HTML, well, let me just finish writing this line. So this is going to equal and just this dash. Inner HTML is something that you can use on any HTML element to set the HTML to something different. So now the HTML within this turn counter is going to be this line. So if we look in here, right now, here's the turn counter, and within the turn counter is nothing.
between these two brackets here, there's nothing there. But when we do this turn counter.inner HTML, it's going to put a dash right in the turn counter. So we'll do the else here. We're going to do on equals false, and then turn counter dot inner HTML equals, and we're going to set it back to nothing. So let's just see if this works now. I'll save that, refresh, and if I turn the power on, you'll now see this line appear when I check it and uncheck it. So this is starting to have at least some functionality. We're going to do a few more things in the else here. I'm going to make sure it's higher so it's easier to see. So we're going to do a few more things when you turn this off. So we're going to clear the color. So this is a function. This is how you call a function in JavaScript. I still need to define this function. But let's say you're playing the game and one of the colors lit up. When you turn the power off, all the colors should, all the lights should go off, or the colors that are a lighter color should go back to the darker color. And then the other thing we're going to do is to clear an interval. Now, I'm going to be talking more about what this is more later when I define the interval, but I'll just put it here now, and we're going to come back to that. You can see we passed in this interval ID. So just keep this in mind. We're going to come back to that later. I'm going to explain that. So we have the on button done. The final thing is the start button. So just like before, we're going to do an add event listener, and it's going to be a click event listener, and we're going to do a function, an anonymous function in here. It's an arrow function. And here we're going to just do one thing. If this is the start button, and it should only do something if the game is on. So if on, or there's been a win, we are going to play. So let me go through this. If on, this is just a shorthand way of saying if on equals true, or when equals true, then call the play function, which we're going to get to in a minute here. It'll play the game. So you click the start button, and we're going to play the game. So that's what we're going to do now, is define the play function. So this is how. So this is one way to define a function. This is called an arrow function that was introduced in ES6. There's another way to define a function. A more common way is like this. I'm going to use the function keyword, function play, and I'm going to. So this is the name of the function. This is anything we're going to pass in to the function, which is going to be nothing in this case, and then the whole function is going to take place within these curly braces here. So first of all, I'm going to go up and actually add some semicolons to these here, and when we first try to play the game, the first thing we want to do is reset variables. Now, if it's the first time you've played the game, the variables will already be reset, but if you're playing again, we just want to make sure the variables have been reset. So let's see, we're going to set win to equal false because you're starting the game, you haven't won yet. Order is going to equal an empty array. We're going to fill that in a second here. The player order again is going to equal an empty array. The flash is going to equal 0. There's been 0 flashes. Interval ID equals 0. Let me scroll a little bit here. turn equals 1, turn counter dot inner HTML equals 1. So this count is going to go to 1 as soon as you press start, because we're on the first round of the game. What else we're going to have? Good equals true. That means the player hasn't hit anything incorrect yet. And now we are going to use a for loop to fill up this order. So we need to randomly fill up this order of this array here. So we have 4 different quadrants. So we're going to fill up this array with a random series of numbers to indicate the order that these are going to light up in the game. So this is how we're going to do the for loop. For var, so when you have a for loop, you pass in 3 different things. You initialize a variable, I equals 0. We're going to loop until I is, or we are going to loop while I is less than 20, and then at the end of the loop we're going to increment I. So it's going to go through this loop 20 times, because in this game you have to do 20 rounds before you win the game. So this is how we're going to fill the array. Order.push math.floor math.random times 4 and then plus 1. So this whole line basically gets a random numbers between 1 and 4 and fills this array. So this is the array. We're going to push something onto the array, and what we're going to push onto the array, we have a random number. This gets a random decimal, but when we multiply it by 4 and then add 1 here, it gets the number between 1 and 5. But it could still be a decimal, so math.floor is going to round it down. So we can actually see what happens here by just doing another console.log. So I'm going to do console.log, and I'm just going to log order. So if we go into our page here, and I'm going to open up the JavaScript console, okay, with the power button and the start button, you will see that we have this array. This is an array right in the console, and it's just 20 random numbers between 1 and 4. So that's how we've made this array that's going to show the order that those lights are going to flash in the game. So let's go back over here, and we'll set the comp turn to equal true. It starts with the computer flashing lights, and then the player has to match those lights. And then we start the first turn. So this, I'm going to just type and then I'll explain what it means. The interval ID equals set interval game turn 800. So let me break this down. Set interval means it's going to run a function after every certain amount of milliseconds. So set interval, it's going to run the game turn function every 800 milliseconds. That's going to make it so the computer flashes a light on here every 800 milliseconds, and it's going to keep repeating until this interval is cleared. Now the interval is going to clear after all the lights have flashed, but I haven't done that yet. But we need this interval ID here. That's what we set up here, and we have it down here. The reason why we have an interval ID is so we can clear the interval. So I told you we're going to come back up to here. If you turn the power off, clear interval, that means it's going to stop Simon from flashing the colors, because it's going to stop running the game turn function every 800 milliseconds. And the game turn function is what flashes the colors. So this starts the game. So now that we've referenced the game turn function, let's define the game turn function. Okay, the game turn function. So I define the function the same way, function game turn, and then we are going to say what's going to happen when this function is called. So on is going to equal false. Now this is just a tricky thing where whenever on equals false, the player cannot click any of these buttons. So while the computer is flashing colors, we don't want the player to be able to click any of the buttons. So that's why on is set to false here. So now, let's see, if flash equals turn, then we're going to do something. So that means if the number of times the lights have flashed equals the turn that we're on, the turn shows right here, then that means the computer's turn is over. So if the computer's turn is over, we're going to clear the interval. In a bit we'll show what happens if the computer's turn is not over. But if it's done flashing all the lights like that, we're going to clear the interval. This is what we talked about earlier with the interval ID. Comp turn is going to equal false. And then we're going to clear the color if any colors are lit up. And on is going to equal true. Now that on is equal to true, that means the player can now start pressing buttons on there. So down here, if it is the computer's turn, then we'll do these things. If the turn's not over, if it's the first thing we're going to do, we're going to clear the color because we're going to clear the color from the last time the computer lit up something. Oh, and that reminds me, I forgot to put the parentheses on the end. Whenever you're going to call a function, you have to put parentheses on the end of the name there. So clear the color, and now I'm going to set a timeout. Set timeout is very similar to set interval. So set interval is going to keep repeating this over and over. Set timeout is going to do something once after a certain number of milliseconds. So again, I'm going to use one of these arrow functions from ES6, and it's going to run this function after a certain number of milliseconds. So I'll put the milliseconds at the end. So I haven't defined what the function is, but you can see here that it's going to wait 200 milliseconds and then do what's in here. So what's in here is it's going to flash a number or a color. So we have to know what colors it's going to flash. Is it going to flash the green, red, yellow, or blue? So we're going to have an if statement here. So if order flash equals 1, okay, let me explain this line here. So remember, order is an array, and so flash is the number of times we've flashed a color, and flash starts at 0, and so 0 is the first item in the array. So if the first item in the array is 1, and remember this array is an array of random numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. So if the first item is 1, we're going to run the 1 function, which we have to define later. That's going to flash the green right here. And I'm just going to copy this line, and we're going to do it 3 more times. Another thing is, normally with an if statement here, you're going to put in these parentheses what the condition is. And then you're going to have a curly brackets, and you're going to run the things in the curly brackets. if the condition is true. But you can also skip the curly brackets and just put the thing to run if the condition is true right after the parentheses. So inside the parentheses is the condition, and then right afterwards is the function you're going to run if this condition is true. So this is going to be 2, 3, 4, and these are going to be functions 2, 3, 4. So it's going to run the function depending on what the number is. And then the last thing that has to happen is the flash has to be incremented. So it started at 0, but it's going to go up 1 every time the computer flashes. This happens after 200 milliseconds. Because of this set interval up here, a light is going to flash every 800 milliseconds. But since we have this 200 milliseconds here, that means it's going to stop flashing for 200 milliseconds, and it's going to flash again to the end of the 800 milliseconds. Well, I can demonstrate it by just making these functions here, the 1, 2, 3, 4 functions, and we can actually run this and see what happens. So I'm going to make the function 1. And we're not going to pass in things to any of these functions. That's why this is always empty here. And now we're going to say if noise. And so if it should make a noise, then it will make a noise. Remember, we had these sounds here in our HTML, and now we're going to use them in our JavaScript. So var audio equals document dot get element by ID clip 1. So this get element by ID is pretty much, it's very similar to the query selector, but query selector, you can use any CSS selector, and get element by ID, you just put an ID in here. But since we already know it's an ID, we don't have to put a hash mark. Now I could have put query selector and then put hash mark clip 1, but I just wanted to show you a different way you could do this. Now this ID clip 1 is right here. If we go back to our HTML, clip 1 here, so we're now getting this sound effect. And on the next line, we are going to play it by doing audio.play. Now, we could have put this at the top, but I decided to do it this way where it's right in here instead of up here with the rest. And actually, I'm going to make one more change really quick. Instead of var, this will be a let. I already told you that we don't really use var anymore. It's going to play the sound. I'm going to set the noise to equal true just in case it was set to false. Now you'll understand more of this noise thing later when I show you when the noise is set to false. And then top left dot style dot background color equals light green. Okay, let me break this down for you. So top left is this thing right here that we got with the query selector. Style means we're going to change the CSS style. You can change CSS using JavaScript. And we're going to change the background color element. Right now, background color is green, but we're going to set it to light green. If I go into my style and I find top left, actually the background is dark green, and then I set the background color to be light green. So we have this thing here for what happens when you click the 1. Now it's going to be pretty similar for 2, 3, and 4. So I'm just going to copy this. And that's going to be 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to change this to 2. And this is clip 2. And the color is going to be tomato. Now, just so you know, I could be using hex codes or some other way to indicate a color, but HTML has a set of keywords that you can use to specify certain colors. So tomato is a keyword to signify a specific color in HTML that you will see soon when I do the example. So this is going to be 3, and set that to 3. 4, set that to 4. This color is going to be yellow, and then this color is going to be light sky blue. Okay, I think we have enough code here to do an example. So let me save that. I'll refresh here, and if I press start, okay, it's not working. Let's check the console. Clear color is not defined. Oh yeah, so I just spelled this wrong. So let's see, clear color, and then I'll refresh. Now let's try, see if I get any clear. Okay, it's still, I spelled it wrong, but then another problem is that I actually never defined that function. So let's do that right now. I'm going to go down here, clear color. Oh, I have to put the word function. So function clear color. I'm going to use a line very similar to this, where it says top left.style.background color equals light green. So top left.style.background color equals dark green, because that's the initial color that we specified in the CSS. And then same with this one. Now I'm seeing another problem. Now that I'm actually copying and pasting, we have top left here. This is supposed to be, okay, we got top left here. This is supposed to be top right. This is supposed to be bottom left. And this is supposed to be bottom right. So now I can continue to copy and paste, and I'll be getting the right code here. So let's see. This, instead of tomato, is going to be dark red. And then the bottom left, instead of yellow, is going to be golden rod. See, these are all HTML color names. And then the bottom right, instead of light sky blue, is going to be dark blue. Okay, let's see if we're going to get any errors now. I'll power this on, press start, and it seems to be working. So let me close that for now. So you can see it just went, but it never really went back. So let's see if we've done something wrong. I was expecting the color to turn off at some point. Oh, the problem was I put dark color here instead of dark green. So it never turned back to dark green. So let's try it again. I'll save this, refresh, and start this. Okay, so now it turned green. But now I can't click it though. So I'm trying to click here to show that I know that this just lit up, but that's not working because we haven't programmed that yet. So that's the next thing we're going to program. So to make it so a player can click these colors, we're going to have some more event listeners. So let me move this code up a little bit, and I'm going to add some more event listeners. So top left dot add event listener, and this is going to be another click event listener because we're just listening for the user to click the top left. And just like before, event, so now we're going to check if it's on. We only want a user to be able to click there if the program is on. So if it is on, we'll do a few things. The player order dot push 1. Remember, player order is an array of the sections that the player has clicked or pressed. So if the player pushes here, we're going to push 1 onto the player order array. Then we're going to check if the player was correct. This is going to be a function to check to see if the player was right. Now, whether or not the player was right, we're going to call the one function. Now, this is the same function that the computer called that just lights up that color. And now, if the player has not won, if the player is not won yet, then we're going to set the timeout. And we're going to clear the color. So after 300 milliseconds, we're going to make sure the color is cleared, that the color that the user clicked is going to clear after 300 milliseconds. Let's actually test this out, but I'm going to comment out this checking if they've won because we haven't made that function yet. So let me refresh here. Oh, actually it only works if I click up here. Yep. That worked. Except the color didn't clear because I forgot to put parentheses here. So let me just try again to make sure everything works. Okay, we got that one to work. And now, well, let me uncomment this. I'm just going to do some copying and pasting because we're going to do this for every corner. So we got top left. Now I'm going to do top right. And for top right, we're going to push on the number 2. We're going to call the to function, but everything else will be the same. So now we have bottom left, bottom, push on a 3. This is going to be 3. Everything else is the same. Now we have bottom right, push on a 4, 4, and everything is the same. And now we just need our check function. These are all calling a check function, and this will be one of our more complicated functions. So let's get to it. Function check. And so we're going to check if it's correct. So if player order, in these brackets I'll put player order dot length minus 1. That just means the last thing that the player clicked. If the player order does not equal the real order at player order dot length minus 1, the last thing that the player clicked, then good equals false. So if they're not the same, good equals false. Remember, good is true if the player is getting everything correct, and good is false if the player has something incorrect. We'll just put that on through the next line so it's easier to read. And so now, if player order dot length equals 20, that means they've gotten every single one right, and good, that means they haven't missed anything. If good equals true, now I could have just put and good. I didn't have to put good equals true. In fact, I will just do that. If we're on the 20th round and good, we haven't got anything wrong, then we'll call the win game function. If good equals false, that means the player got something wrong. We're going to do something else. So first, I'm going to flash the color. This is a function that we still have to write. Then the turn counter dot inner HTML is going to equal no. That just means right in here, it's going to say no. And then the next thing that's going to happen is that we're going to set a timeout. And then the turn counter is going to be set back to the turn number. So it was the turn counter was set to no, but after a certain amount of milliseconds, it's going to go back to the turn number. And then also we're going to clear the color. So we are flashing the color here, and then we're going to clear the color here after a certain number of milliseconds. And I'll just put those milliseconds, which is going to be 800 milliseconds. We're also going to do something special if we're in strict mode here. So if strict if we're in strict mode, I'm going to call the play function. And remember, play function is just like repeating the whole game, starting the game over with. Else, if we're not in strict mode, then we can repeat the round. So let me set some things up here to repeat the round. So if you get something wrong, then the round is repeated if you're not in strict mode. So comp turn is going to equal true, and the flash is going to equal 0, and the player order is going to be an empty array. Good equals true, because we're back to having nothing wrong because the round has just started. And interval ID equals set interval. So we're starting this just like we did before in the play function with a set interval by calling game turn with every 800 milliseconds. And then the final thing that's going to be in this function is noise equals false. So remember, we're still in the good equals false if statement. So if the player got something wrong, we're not going to play a noise. Noise is going to equal false. You only play the noise if the player got it clicked on the right thing. So now we can see up here why we check to see if noise is true. We have a few conditions so far. The condition if the player wins the game, the condition if the player is wrong, but now there's the condition if the player got it correct but has not won the game yet. So that's the condition I'm going to do now. So if turn equals player order dot length and good, and we haven't won yet, then turn plus plus. So we've now gone to the next turn, and we're going to clear the player order for the next turn to begin. Comp turn is going to equal true. Flash is going to equal 0. Turn counter dot inner HTML equals turn. Now there's some code that's repeated from here to here, so there could be some room for refactoring here. And interval ID equals set interval game turn. Yeah, again, this would be a prime place for some refactoring since we have some repeated code here. And that's it for this check function. But within the check function, we reference two functions that haven't been created yet: the win game function and the flash color function. So let's do those now. First, the flash color function. It's going to be very similar to the check color function. So similar that I'm going to start by copying and pasting. So the flash color, do flash color. We're going to just set these to the other colors. So light green And then instead of dark red, it's going to be tomato. Instead of goldenrod, we'll have yellow. And this is going to be light sky blue. And then the other function is the win game function. I'll put that at the end. So function win game. And so when the game, if someone has won the game, first we're going to do the flash color function that I just defined here. Whoops. And then we're going to do turn counter dot inner HTML is going to be set to when, and on is going to equal false. So now a user can't click anything because on is equal to false, and then when is equal to true because the game has been won. And that actually should be the full game. So let's do some tests to see if anything goes wrong. So just saved. I'm going to refresh here. So let's see, we'll hit the power button, start. Okay. Okay, let's see what happens when you press the wrong thing. It says no, and then it goes back. Ooh, it was supposed to play this again, but it didn't. So let's see what went wrong. Okay, I have a spelling error right here. So this said sticked, it should say strict. I'm sure some of the viewers probably saw that I spelled that wrong. Okay, so that was supposed to be if strict. So let's save that, refresh. Let's see what happens here. Okay, good. It replayed from where I lost. Now if I should turn it on to strict mode, if I get something wrong, it should replay from the beginning. It should start a new game if I get something wrong. Yep, it went down to 1. It just started a new game. Now let's test what happens if we win. Now I'm not going to sit here and go through 20 rounds to see what happens when I win. I'm going to just make a change in the code here. So instead of length equal 20, I'm going to change this to length equal 3 so we can check what happens after 3 rounds for winning the game. Here it comes. Yep. And see, all of them light up and it says win right there. And so we should be able to start again by just pressing the start button. Yep. And then if we we can turn it off anytime. See, I click the power button and the light went out and then this went out. So we have just created an entire Simon game. Everything works. I talked about some areas of refactoring that you may be able to work on your own. You can make this design a little better. Some of this code that was repeated, we can try to not have repeated code. And I saw some other places, like right here, if comp turn, this could really even be an else statement. And you may be able to figure out a way to not even have the comp turn variable. But that's something you can try to figure out on your own. Thanks for watching. Again, my name is Bo Carnes. Don't forget to subscribe, and remember, use your code for good.